Okay, so here's the plan. I've got my designs, as you see here, for the musical instruments, and we're going to be making some trays like you see here. So the tray is going to be in one kind of wood, and then the musical instrument is going to be an inlay on the inside in a contrasting wood colour. So to start off with, we're going to be doing cherry for the tray and then maple for the inlay. And then after we've done that, we're going to get fancy. So I've basically got an upgraded version for each of these designs, which is just a little bit fancier. And we're going to make them in walnut, which is going to be really nice, and maple is the inlay. And those extra details in the fancy designs I spoke about, we're going to be picking them out with some brass and some aluminium. So I'm really hoping that's going to take it to the next level. But to begin with, we're going to be doing the basic designs that you see here in the cherry, in the maple. So let's get on with the build. So the first one didn't really work out. As you can see, I thought I had enough clearance at the back, which I did, but what's happened is the front of the dust boot has hit one of these clamps, which has stopped it coming this way, right on the bottom layer, right at Z equals 0. And what that's meant is that it's missed a couple of steps and it's cut across here. So unfortunately that's a scrap and I'm going to have to start again, but that's all part of the fun, isn't it? I changed the fixturing to use these low profile clamps you see on screen. They work really well and I machined the rest of the cherry without any further problems. One change I would make is to use a down cut bit. As you can see, the up cut bit I did use left quite a messy edge. However, it wasn't the end of the world. With a bit of sanding, everything actually came out quite nicely. Next, I turned my attention to the maple, and I only have big thick pieces, so it was clear I was going to have to cut them down into thinner sheets. Now I don't have a bandsaw and I really did not feel comfortable cutting this on my table saw. It gave me the heebie-jeebies, to be honest. So instead I decided to do it the old-fashioned way with a handsaw. In theory this seems great, but what is only a couple of seconds of on-screen footage in reality took several hours of manual labour. However, it did keep me out of mischief, and at the end of it I still had all my fingers left, which can only be considered a success. I flipped it over for one last cut and was rewarded with 5 good sheets of wood. Now they aren't perfectly smooth, as you can see from the gouges in the surface, but they aren't bad considering it was all done by hand. I should also mention that these sheets are over twice the thickness I need them to be, and I did that so I could sand them and machine them down to get a perfectly flat surface, which, after a small interlude, is exactly what I'm going to show you next. Here's the full set of cherry trays and maple inlays, ready to be glued together. Now, it did take quite a lot of sanding to make them fit, and even then they needed some gentle encouragement from a rubber hammer to make them fit into place. Now, I designed them to have a 0.25mm gap, but I think that's a bit small, so I'll definitely be increasing it for the next set. Despite the somewhat snug fit, they all actually went together quite well without any problems, no snaps or breaks, and I was really pleased with how they were looking at this point. Now, the eager-eyed amongst you will see that the maple inlays aren't flush with the cherry trays, and that's intentional. It's because I've left some additional material both on the inlay and on the floor and the walls of the tray, so that I can cut them down to size in a final operation on the CNC. Now, this is very sensitive to the alignment of the workpiece, and I only had 0.5 millimeter of extra material to play with, so I did have to be careful. Fortunately, this all worked exactly as I'd hoped, and I got an accurate cut on the walls and the floor of the tray. Despite my best efforts, there were a couple of gaps, probably coming from some uneven sanding earlier on, so what I did is mixed up some of the leftover sawdust with a bit of glue to make a filler, and I rubbed it into the gaps. I did one final check just to make sure everything still worked. And since it did, I went on to apply the oil. Sadly, I did find that glue residue made the saxophone in particular very patchy, as the oil would not soak in where there was glue. However, I managed to solve this with some targeted sanding, lots of sanding, and a reapplication of the oil when I needed it. Right, there we have it. That is the basic versions finished, and I'm actually really pleased with them. As with any project, if you look closely, there are one or two little imperfections, but the overall effect is very close to what I was going for. But I did promise you some fancy versions, so I think it's now time to reveal the design for them, which incorporates those bits of metal, and then we'll quickly get on with making them. Right, here are the designs. We've got a fancy piano, a fancy sax, and a fancy guitar. As you can see, the guitar uses aluminium for those extra details, whilst the sax and the piano are both going to use brass. To get started, I placed a big piece of walnut onto the machine and roughed out the centre of the trays, followed by a contour toolpath around the outside to make the basic shape. Walnut machines really nicely, although even with the dust boot on, I seem to get chips absolutely everywhere. Fortunately, my vacuum was up to the job and cleaned up without any difficulty. Next up was the carving for each instrument, and here you might actually be able to spot some of the subtle differences between the two designs for the basic and the fancy trays. Of course, a new set of trays also meant a whole lot more sawing, but I was in the groove of it by now, and it gave me something to do whilst the machine was running. After some off-screen surfacing and sanding, I moved on to the inlays, starting with the maple like you see here, and then getting ready for the metal. I used the tape and glue method to mount the brass and aluminium onto a piece of scrap plywood, and then aligned it with the axes of my machine using the dog hole system I've cut into the wasteboard. Now, I will admit that I went a bit too aggressive with the speeds and feeds when cutting the aluminium, and as I captured this footage, my hands and arms were being sprayed with high-speed chips, which was really actually quite painful. It was clear something wasn't quite right, and the tool break which followed very much confirmed this. I could feel the metal getting hot, so I decreased the spindle speed and increased the feed rate to get a higher chip load. Then I decreased the depth of cut to lessen the overall cutting forces. This seemed to do the job, and the second attempt went well. At this point, I was trying to demonstrate my sanding technique, but I dropped the metal and it bounced off out of sight. After an extensive search, I found the little tinker hiding down the back of a shelf and reunited it with its friends for a close-up shot of my aluminium components. Next, I machined the brass and saw this cool shimmering effect as the chips danced with the vibrations of each cut. Visuals aside, it machined very nicely, and I got good parts on the first attempt, which was fortunate as I only had enough material for one go. As the afternoon turned into evening, I saw the final rays of sun shining through the windows of my workshop, and I assembled together all my components for a test fit. Seeing the materials come together after all that work was just so satisfying, and I headed inside for dinner with my family, feeling that all was well in my small corner of the world. I returned the next morning with a little cutting and sanding, and once that was done, it was time for the final assembly. Well, here's my finished kit ready to put together, and there's a couple of things I'd like to draw your attention to. The first is actually just how lovely the wood is. I really like this sort of gradient you get on walnut, where you see the light going into dark, and actually we've got it on all of them. You can see it on the saxophone there as well. So I'm hoping, especially once we've got the oil on, that's going to really pop. Now the other thing is the tolerances. So I made them slightly looser because I had to do quite a bit of sanding on the first set, and I'm just so pleased with how these came out. Look, they just sit so snugly in there. And this is a 0.35mm rather than a 0.25mm gap. I'm not going to push it all the way, but you can see that it just fits in there perfectly, and I've basically done no sanding to make that happen. Now, I'd also like to talk about the design a little bit, because those of you familiar with machining will know that when you've got a cutter, which has got obviously a diameter, you can't get a perfectly square or perfectly tight internal corner. You can get sharp external corners, but not internal, because of the cutter having to get in there. So what I've had to do throughout this is, whilst there are actually quite a few sharp bits down here and up here, you'll notice that they are all external corners, whereas all of the internal corners are rounded, because they have to be. Now, speaking of which, I am slightly worried about the top here. I think the guitar is probably going to need a little bit of filling once we've got that in, but do you know what? That's just the way of it. It was never going to be perfect first time, was it? So that brings me on to the final plan. So we've now got the kit, and I'm going to assemble it, starting with the wood glue. So we're going to glue in all of the wood inlays, and then obviously that wouldn't work for the metal because it's not permeable. So that's where we're going to come back with the super glue. And then once all of that's glued in place, we're going to put it on the machine for one final time, and we're going to surface the floor of each of them to get it to the final thickness. So yeah, time to crack on with that. Right, now's what you've been waiting for. It's time for the final reveal. So let's see all of those trays together for the first time. We've got our basic trays in cherry and maple at the top, and underneath our recently finished trays in walnut with those extra pieces of metal that elevate the design to that next level. Now the real hero here is without doubt the materials. All three types of wood have come out beautifully with the oil, and I do think those shiny bits of metal really add to the fancy versions. I'll need to find a home for these trays, maybe somewhere in the workshop or somewhere in the house. I mean, to be honest, they almost feel a little bit too nice to use, which I'm aware completely defeats the point. I would like them to be functionally used in some shape or form, so I'll have a little think about where I can put them. All right, I think that's pretty much us done for this project. But before you go, I do have a question to pose to you, which is we've got our basic version and our fancy version. What does the next step fancier look like? You know, what materials, what shapes does it use? I don't know, but if you've got any ideas, please feel free to put them in the comments. Other than that, I'd just like to say I've really enjoyed doing this project, and I do hope that comes across on camera. And I hope you've enjoyed watching it too, and we'll stop by for the next one. All right, catch you later.